Okay, so welcome everybody to this June edition of Plant Health Club. My name's Gail Preston. I'm the Vice President of the BSPP and one of the conveners of the Plant Health Club sessions, which aim to bring together people who are interested in plant health worldwide to talk about the skills and challenges that we face and to help sort of support each other. And at the beginning of the summer, many researchers are in the position of welcoming new researchers to their research group, or you may be welcoming them in the autumn. And we need to think about the process of how we introduce those new researchers to sort of a career in research. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to be joined by my colleague David Studholm from the University of Exeter and Katja Hugard, and we're going to talk you through some of the principles of effective mentoring. So I'm going to pass over to Katja to introduce the sort of logistics of the session.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see everybody's lively faces here online at this edition of the Plant Health Club. My name is Katja Hugard, and I'm a PhD student working with Professor Colin Turnbull at Imperial College London. Today, I have been invited to co-host our session. I would like to go over the housekeeping rules before we begin. First of all, I would like to make everybody aware that this session is being recorded. The part that's recorded is the intro with Gail and myself, the 3 presentations, and after that, we are going to switch off the recording for the Q&A and discussion section so we can talk more freely. I would like to remind everybody to keep their microphones muted during the intro and presentation section. You are welcome to switch them off and join in the discussion during the Q&A and discussion in breakout rooms. Thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the event.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Katja. So I'm going to kick off. I'm going to share my screen and talk to you about some general principles of mentoring. So just give me a sec. So hopefully everybody can see my screen. Okay, everyone clear on that? Good. Okay, so I thought I'd just start by sharing an image from something I saw circulated on social media just a couple of days ago, which was a workshop in Germany where they asked the attendees at the To Be Honest conference what was most helpful in their career development. And they made this nice word cloud out of it. And what you can see is that multiple times, and would be by far the largest one if it was sort of consistent with mentorship, mentors, sort of say in general. So mentors are really key in supporting researchers in their careers. And many of the first experiences researchers have of mentorship and in their careers is their first project, which may be an undergraduate sort of summer studentships, which are the ones we support through the BSPP, or it may be a research project that they're undertaking in the context of their degree studies. And there are many benefits of research for these sort of students. That helps them develop their knowledge, their critical thinking, develop their networks, their contacts. They start to develop skills in time management, data analysis, and communication skills. They get to work often in a team environment, develop their team skills, and often informs their career decisions and helps them make a competitive application if they go on to apply for master's study or doctoral study, or careers that are sort of relevant to science. And it's for some students, there are specific benefits. So for example, I'm involved with a program in Oxford called Unique Plus, where we specifically target sort of support with our research interns for students from groups that are underrepresented in science at the background in terms of the groups they belong to or their socioeconomic background. So there may be specific benefits for specific groups of students. There are also significant benefits of getting involved in mentoring these early careers of projects for mentors that also develop your knowledge and your critical thinking, as well as your mentoring skills, which are key if you're going to go on to a career in science. It'll help you, particularly with your time management, that you will have an extra pair of hands potentially available that will be generating some data and some insights that may be useful for your research and may complement your research. You're going to be developing your communication skills, your teamwork skills, and again, your experience in mentoring may inform your career decisions and help you apply competitively for jobs or grants in the future. So where do we start if we've got a new member joining the lab? Well, first of all, even before we get started, we want to do what we can to get to know them, figure out what they already know from their sort of degree studies, from their reading, the skills they already have, what they want to learn as part of the internship, what's most important for them, what expectations they have of the experience that they're going to have during their internship, what are their aspirations beyond the internship, are they thinking about sort of doctoral study and how this might position them to apply for that. And it's also important to get more of the sense of them in terms of the factors that might affect them at work. What's going to affect their working practices or hours? Do they have caring responsibilities? Do they have any disabilities that might affect sort of how they are able to work? And so you can put reasonable adjustments or accommodations in place, and you can think about how you might address that. You want to check with them whether they're going to need any assistance before or when they arrive, and that might be with just guidance on travel, might need advice on accommodation. If they're coming and traveling internationally, we might need to look at what sort of visa they need, and they might need assistance with healthcare, say, or with care and responsibilities. So make sure even before they get started, you talk systematically through all of the things that you might need to sort of make the best start before they arrive. So let me just slow down with these things. One thing that I find can be particularly useful for researchers at various stages in their careers can be to encourage them to do a sort of form of self-evaluation. And for this, what we do in my group is we adapt something that I picked up as an exercise from another researcher who's got some fantastic resources available on mentoring, does great work. It's called Carolee Bull at Penn State University. And what she encourages her mentees to do is to work through a sort of self-assessment questionnaire. And you can see an example of the types of questions here, and I'll post an example in the chat later on, that encourages mentees to think about where they already are sort of at in terms of the range of different skills, whether it's their quantitative skills, their communication skills, their knowledge, when they're starting a project, and then to revisit this later on. So for graduate students, I often recommend that they revisit this, for example, every term or every sort of 3 months or so you can start to continuously reflect on how you're developing and how you're improving. And what Carolee emphasizes is that these are not only the skills for yourself, but they're also the skills that if someone is going on to write a reference for you, that they're going to be picking up on. So not just think about whether you have these skills and what you might need to develop them, but whether your mentors and the sort of supervisor knows that you have these skills and knows the effort that you're putting into developing them, because that can help in the future going forward to writing references. And this is another example of an assessment that Carolee has available through her website, an intern assessment, which is designed as something to be done sort of collaboratively between the mentee and the mentor to help you systematically think about where the sort of the mentee is starting from in terms of their skills and how they've developed over the course of their internship. So you can start sort of to set goals based on a strong grounding of where you start from and where you aim to get to. Of course, as you start a project, it's also important to reflect on sort of your knowledge, both of the project and as a mentor. Many of you may be postdocs or senior graduate students, and your supervisor perhaps is the one who said, well, let's do this exciting project. And it might be very relevant to your project, or it might be something quite different from your project. So you need to reflect yourself on how well you know the background of the project, how confident you are in the skills that are going to be needed, such to the extent that you could actually train somebody else. You know, what are your potential strengths as a mentor? How do you work best with others? Are there skills that you want to improve, either scientifically or in terms of your mentoring? You need to think about your working practices and hours and how that will fit alongside having a mentee working with you. And you need to think about how you're going to best include mentoring alongside the other work that's going to go on at the same time. And so with all of this in mind, this background to the project, then you can put a project development plan in place where you can think about how do you and your mentee make sure that you have the knowledge to undertake the project, that you can support the mentee in developing the skills that they need to undertake the project, and also making sure that you have the resources in place, both in terms of sort of say physical resources like sort of consumables or space to grow plants, but also in terms of the time and the support available from yourself and others. So these early stages, it's important to have really clearly defined goals relating to sort of the knowledge that the mentee might need or you might need. You need to think if it's a more experimental project that you've put in place arrangements in relation to safety training or specifics to do with ethics for some projects. You need to have quite defined goals, realistic goals in terms of your experiments, the data you're trying to generate, and how you're going to report on that data. And you want to have clear goals in terms of the meetings and milestones that you're going to have that will be around that project. But for the mentee themselves, in conjunction with all of this self-reflection, you might want to set specific skills-based goals and specific work and tasks focused on these skills-based goals. There might be goals related to improving scientific writing or coding skills or specific technical skills or data analysis. And whenever you're setting a goal, you're always thinking, well, what's my goal and how will I know whether I've achieved it? And sometimes it might be sort of very much a one-to-one relationship between you and your mentee, but quite often work that's ongoing involves a team of researchers or even a team of mentees. So if you're working not just one-to-one with a researcher, but you're actually working with a team of researchers, in addition to thinking about the development of that individual researcher, you'll need to think about how you work with this group of mentees as a team. How do you encourage them to sort of support each other and to form a team? How can you clarify the roles and goals that are going to exist for that team? You're going to think about the activities that you do to build the relationships within that team, both effective working relationships and social relationships. How do you track progress as a team? And how do you solve problems as a team, which is an iterative process of tracking where you are, figuring out what the next problem is to solve, solving it, and then going through. And of course, it's really important that at any point that you do achieve anything as a team, that you go on to celebrate success at that point. So one framework that people find really useful in thinking about how do you go about setting goals is sometimes called the SMART framework, which is where we have a goal you set, whether it's generating a particular piece of data or whether it's learning a specific skill, that you make sure that that goal is specific, you know, what you want to accomplish and why, and you know, how you're going to do it, that it's measurable, you know, when it's been accomplished, and it's attainable, that you have everything in place in order to be able to achieve it in terms of the knowledge, skills, abilities, and resources. It's important that the goals you set are realistic. And by realistic, I mean that the goals you set are achievable by you or your mentee while maintaining your well-being. And with that in mind, often these student projects are short projects, so you need to think quite carefully about the time frame for this project and make sure that the goals are grounded within a particular realistic, achievable time frame, and that you have flexibility built in to accommodate any challenges that could arise. So you're going to, at the start of a project, come up with a plan. It's probably not going to be the same plan that you're going to, when you look back, you're going to see at the end of the project, but you're going to want to set really quite explicit goals in terms of regular meetings with your mentee and the milestones of achievements for the project. And many of you are quite familiar with this goal setting from other activities you've done, such as writing grants or writing project proposals. And typically, when you see project planning, we think in terms of these Gantt charts, where we have this sort of series of tasks, and then we have this relatively linear example of work that we're going to undertake in order to achieve these tasks with a reporting period at the end of these tasks. And definitely you should be thinking about producing something that looks a bit like this to support your project. But what that type of representation lacks, and what you might need to think a bit more about, is the relationships between these tasks. Sometimes completing one task, for example, this sort of say middle task, is dependent on multiple other tasks. So you also need to think not just about this linear progression, but where the dependencies might exist within the tasks that you're planning with your mentee. And this approach to project planning is sometimes described in project management terms as a waterfall approach, where you conceive a project, you then do the project, and then you review the project, and then you're done. So this initial planning stage might involve multiple people, then a person or a small team of people go away and do it, and then it happens. But particularly for short projects or team-based projects, this waterfall method, often say exemplified by your Gantt chart, isn't necessarily the best way to go. And I tend to think that for short projects and for projects in general, an approach that's sometimes called the agile approach can be a much better and more effective approach. And here, rather than taking your project and seeing it as a great big task, you break it down into lots of short, achievable tasks. So your time becomes segmented into short chunks, and each chunk has an outcome, and that at each stage, you have multiple people saying, this is the important thing to do now. Someone goes away and does it, and then you review what you've done, and then you come back. And this is how a lot of teams work in sort of really sort of say active sectors, like say the software development sector in industry, where you're basically defining something achievable, getting it done, and then moving on to sort of the next step. Doesn't mean you don't have long-term goals, but it means you always know what you're doing within the next week, or what you're doing tomorrow, and you have a really clearly defined short-term goal. And this can be really rewarding for mentees, because again, it helps them feel like they're achieving something, because it's very easy within a project to, within say an 8-week project, to not actually get to everything that you plan to do, sort of say done within that project because of various factors. But by having these more short-term goals with sort of varying levels of risk, you make sure that there are definite achievable goals within your project, which really helps to maintain momentum and progress. And you can bring in multiple perspectives at multiple points, and that helps to define things and solve any problems that arise. And for many of you, you'll be doing this routinely within your lab groups, through your weekly sort of lab or sort of fortnightly lab group meetings, where you come together and you review progress against your goals. And coming back to team projects, if what you're trying to achieve involves not just one person, but multiple people, you'll need to think about ways in which you monitor and track the work that's being undertaken by the different members of your team. Often there's good strategies for doing that. I think using an approach like something I've called a Kanban board, where you have defined tasks assigned to people, and you have ways of monitoring who's doing what, when, and what the priority is for that. So you've now got your goals. Now you need to go away and train your researchers. And I know that David and Cassie are going to talk a lot more about this, so I'm going to just touch on it very briefly here. The most important thing I think I can emphasize for anybody is that if you are training others, it's really important to pay attention to detail. It's really important to be very systematic. If you're teaching someone a protocol, go through every single step of that protocol, make sure they understand it, demonstrate it in person where possible, so that they can understand exactly how you would do it. Because often what we think we're communicating is what you can see on the left here, with this these stacked blocks of this complete picture. But what we're actually communicating doesn't take into account the knowledge that our trainee lacks. We easily assume a lot of knowledge. And so that in-person, hands-on, systematic training is really key when it comes to training students in either experimental or computational work. And usually most of the problems that I tend to see coming up are because something's been misunderstood, something's been skipped, and just being systematic and explaining what we're doing, why we're doing, and demonstrating in person can really help overcome these challenges. It's why it's often so useful to make a research visit to another research group, just to learn how they do something and to ground truth it and learn from the person who actually does it. It's also worth bearing in mind that whoever you're working with is going to be different from you. And there are many reasons why people might be different from you, because of they might be different in terms of their neurodiversity, their personality. There may be different cultural differences. And while when you're mentoring, what you're often trying to do is kind of exemplify through your approach, an approach that works really effectively, it's always worth bearing in mind that the way you work may not be equally effective for others. And that researchers who come from different cultures may have experienced or learned quite different approaches. People who have different neurodiverse profiles are going to have different ways of working, or different ways in which they process information, and you need to be inclusive of that if you're working with someone who's got a neurodiverse profile. And variation in personality trait can also have a significant effect on how people work and interact. So just to exemplify that, just take something as simple as thinking about time. And for those of us in Northern Europe and North America, that we tend to have a relatively linear sort of set of time that basically says we have a series of tasks, we have allocated time for these tasks, we focus on the future. But in other cultures, they might take a more flexible approach to time that says things take, sort of they might take a bit longer than we expect, and we can accommodate that. And in other cultures, they have a more cyclical approach to time that says, time is plentiful and we can take all the time we need to kind of keep reviewing things and make sure we come to the right decision, or we get things right. And sometimes when you see conflicts coming up within groups, it's because they're working to different time models. So with sort of say linear time, time moves, the future is important, schedules and punctuality important, and the time you spend working determines your success, and you succeed by identifying tasks, focusing on them, getting them done. With flexible time, the present is the most important. Being flexible and adaptable is valued, and the use of time is shaped by what you're doing or the people involved in it. And it's more common perhaps to think about doing lots of things at the same time. It's not the saying that one of these is right and one of these wrong, it's just different perspectives. If you're in a linear time model, then you may find that you end up being too strict and enforcing deadlines that may start to cause stress because of delays or time management issues. You may find you're cutting useful discussions short because you've only allowed a certain amount of time for that discussion. If you're in flexible time, then you might assume that deadlines are flexible when they're not. And you may be less aware that sort of say that lack of punctuality or keeping to time may actually be stressful for others or may be seen as disrespectful. So it's really important to understand who you're working with and to try and find ways in which you can work together effectively, accommodating perhaps differences in culture or perspectives. Similarly, if we think about individuals with a neurodiverse profile, then people might be quite different in how they work or how they relax. So some people will much prefer, for example, one-to-one experiences. Some really like a group experience. Some like a lot of structure and planning. Some like things that are more free flow. When it comes to relaxing, some may just prefer to be by themselves with a book or a computer game. Some may really need to sort of say sport or activity. So it's worth bearing in mind that everybody's different. There's no one right sort of size fits all for everybody. So working with your mentee to understand what's good for them, for their well-being, their working practices is really important and helps support you and them in having the best possible experience. And finally, of course, everybody varies in terms of their personality. The most scientifically grounded sort of description of personality is seen here, where we can classify people on scales of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, and we're all somewhere on each of these axes, and we're all different. So again, as you get to know your mentees, you'll get to sort of find how they're different from you and how you can work effectively with them. A few words about working hours. For best practice, it's often useful to stick to around, say, 40 focused working hours in a week in terms of healthy work and well-being, and to have that well structured so that you can achieve what you need to achieve within that time frame, taking into account any challenges that arise. Rest is really important, and finding some time within that to play is really important. I know that some people might have a perception that to say this time at work equals success. In fact, maintaining your well-being while being effective at work equals success, and that's something ideally we want to instill into our mentees right from their sort of their first experience of science. So work with your mentee to get the right balance between work and play. It's really important to foster curiosity, encourage your mentee to ask lots of questions. Why, how, what does it mean? And encourage them to think about the broader significance and impact of their project. Think about the fact that for many mentees, their next step will be to sit in an interview with a couple of academics who want to ask them questions about the project. Why are you doing this project? Why is it important? Why did you do this experiment this way and not another way? And so you're helping to equip your mentee, both in terms of development as a scientist, but also in preparation perhaps for any sort of say future situations where they may be drawing on their experience of this project to demonstrate their aptitude as a researcher. And don't feel that you need to have all the answers. It's really important to admit when you don't know the answer. And it's also important sometimes when you do know the answer, that rather than just giving your mentee the answer, you support them in reasoning through any problems or questions that they have, because that helps them develop their critical thinking skills. Similarly, Again, with a short time frame, it's really tempting to not allow much time for reading and understanding, to really just focus on doing. But again, that can be a disservice to your mentee in terms of developing them as a researcher and developing their knowledge of the project. So it's really important to develop a reading list, to read together, to make sure you both understand the background of the project or the context of the project. And you might want to set specific goals for consolidating knowledge relevant to the project, whether it's working through the literature, writing up the project, giving presentations. And throughout the project, your mentee will benefit from getting feedback on how they're doing. And in an ideal world, we would be able to give feedback objectively, and what we said to our mentees would be what they would hear. But in practice, people's way of giving feedback and what mentees hear varies. So for some people, they will err towards most things are awesome, and occasionally sort of say it's pretty good. Maybe it's a good start, and they don't really want to say anything negative or anything that could be sort of say dispiriting for the mentee at any time. And for others, they might go the other way, just say nothing's good enough. And for some, just maybe nice and level, everything's fine, or everything's not bad. So in an ideal world, we would be sort of step one, and mentee would feel if they're in the middle of these curves, you know, they're doing okay. Obviously, what we might hope, if say we were telling people they're awesome all the time, is that they think they're amazing. But it's worth bearing in mind that for many people, no matter how much you tell them they're doing well, they actually sort of say have lots of doubts about that. And if you're telling them they're doing well when perhaps they're not doing so well, they will not necessarily believe you. They will say, no, they don't know what's happening. I'm not doing very well. Similarly, if you tell them they're not doing very well all the time, then they will definitely take that message home for them. And if you don't really give them any feedback, then they might either assume they're doing okay, or perhaps they'll still be thinking, I'm not doing very well. So finding good ways of actually concrete ways of conveying to your mentee how they're doing, and providing reassurance. And if anything, be kind, err on the side of being generous. People already have a very critical voice in their head. They're already going to be more critical of themselves in the majority of cases than you would be of them. So think about giving feedback, but also think about giving constructive, positive feedback and how you might do that. And if you do need to give feedback, it's really important to focus on the actions, not the person. Don't say this was a stupid thing to do, that you're incompetent. Say, this was, you misunderstood this, or this is incorrect, or this is a better way of doing this. But you never want to sort of give feedback that implies that something is a trait of a person rather than just a specific action. And obviously, if you want to give significant feedback, think about timing or privacy, but always say just be very specific, concrete, check in with them about what they think, be positive, think about what the next steps are, and make sure that they understand, say, what to do differently going forward into the future. There may be a point, hopefully, that sort of say it won't come up, but it will occasionally, when you might have concerns about a mentee's welfare. Often people are in the mentoring role are the first responders when welfare concerns arise. If you do have concerns, don't take it on yourself. There are lots of support available from your supervisor, from mental health first aiders, from counselling services. So look for support for yourself if you find yourself in this situation. And as we get to the end of the project, it's as important to plan the end of the project as it is to plan the beginning of the project. So think about developing a checklist of what you're going to need to kind of close down the project in terms of reports or samples or files. Go back to encouraging your mentee to reflect on their progress, repeating the self-evaluation, provide constructive feedback, and discuss directions for the future. And often it can be quite useful to have an exit conversation where you talk about their experience, their aspirations, what they might want to come back to you in the future for, whether it's a letter of reference or further mentoring. You might want to talk about how they could capture the skills they've developed through the project in their CV. And you definitely want to talk about where the project will go next, or it could go next, now that they're moving on, so that they see that the project has a future, or what future it could have. And of course, this is a good time to reflect on your own experience of mentoring, get feedback from your mentee or other people about how you developed as a mentor, think about what went well, what the strengths are, and reflect on how you'll improve your skills the next time that you're involved in mentoring. So that, I'm just going to stop there. We're not going to take questions now. I'm going to pass over to David and Katja to give you their perspective, and then we'll do Q&A in the last sort of 15 minutes or so.
Great, thank you, Gail. I'm just going to try to share my screen, and then I will give my thoughts on all of this. So hopefully you can see my presentation now. I'm just going to move this out of the way.
Yeah, that looks good. Yeah.
Brilliant. So I'm David. I'm based at the University of Exeter. And as a member of academic staff, I have a lot of experience of supervising mostly undergraduate projects. So undergraduate students doing their final year project, also master's students. The context of this meeting is really around the BSPP. And I've got pretty limited experience of supervising summer studentships in that. Although I did a few years ago supervise a student on the Waterhouse Fellowship. So that's my sort of BSPP supervision credentials, if you like. So following on from Gail's talk, I mean, my perspective on this really is most of the supervision I've done, sort of 95% of the supervision I've done, has been on students doing computational bioinformatics projects rather than laboratory-based projects. So what I hope is in the question and answer session, I'll be able to field any questions around that kind of aspect. But a few comments just to maybe stimulate some questions for later. First question is, or something we should be asking ourselves before embarking on supervising or mentoring a summer student, is why are we doing this? Why do we want to supervise or mentor this student? All sorts of reasons for that, but specifically how it's different between computational projects and laboratory-based projects. One thing I've really noticed is this: often in a laboratory-based project, it's really useful to the supervisor, to the mentor, to have a pair of hands in the lab. Now, of course, that's not the main reason for doing it, but it is a consideration. Whereas I've found in bioinformatics, computational projects, it's often a net drain, more of a net drain on resources than it is for a laboratory-based project. So I think that's something to bear in mind when we do the sort of cost-benefit analysis of whether we want to go ahead and do this is something to consider. And I'm sure there'll be questions on that later. Having said that, of course, the reasons you embark on taking a student on are not always about just getting a job done most efficiently. You know, there are many other reasons to do it. So Gail has really covered, you know, a lot of the nuts and bolts and the philosophy behind supervision and mentoring these projects. But I thought it might be worth just zooming out a little bit and looking at the whole life cycle, if you like, of a student project or a summer project, and thinking about this. So I think mostly what we're talking about today is the bit in the middle, the bit where the student, the mentee, is in the lab or at their computer doing the research. But actually, we need to look at this in context. The whole process starts off with somebody having an idea. Then that idea has to be funded. So it might be that a supervisor, a academic, or some senior researcher has an idea and then approaches the BSPP or somewhere for funding for this project. So there's the whole funding aspect. Then once you get the funding, you need to recruit somebody. You need to choose an appropriate student. Then you actually get to do the project. Then usually, as Gail pointed out, at the end, you normally have to report on that project, often to the original funders. And then finally, at the end of doing all of this, completing the project and reporting on it, finally, what happens next? Often this will lead to another idea, which leads to another project. Or another thing we need to be considering, and this is maybe for discussion later, is what's the nature of your relationship between the mentor and mentee after the project is over? So often when we talk about mentorship, we're talking about something a bit more long-term than just a short 10-week project, for example. Often mentorship implies, not always, but sometimes implies a longer-term investment and relationship between the mentor and mentee. So I think we should be thinking about how we want that to look. Do we want to keep in touch with our mentee afterwards, and what can we offer them going forward after they finish the project? There are a number of really useful publications. We can get quite academic about this. There's lots of stuff we can read about how we approach mentoring and supervision, and also some of the nuts and bolts about how we actually manage the project while the project's going on. So coming at this from the computational project aspect, a couple of things I wanted to highlight. One is this. So we're focusing now on the actual project, the actual period of time when the student is doing the project. Now, if you were doing this in the laboratory, you would expect the student to keep records in a laboratory notebook. And that's absolutely essential also if you're doing a computational project. It's tempting to think that a computational project is somehow different and you don't need to keep a laboratory book. You definitely do. Now, there's lots of ways you can do this, the old traditional way on pencil and paper, pen and paper. What we actually do in my group is we use Microsoft OneNote, and there's actually quite a nice article published here about the nuts and bolts of doing that. So that enables me as the supervisor or mentor to see in real time the student's notebook. They can also see my feedback on it and so on. So an electronic notebook, OneNote could be something else. OneNote is the way we do it, but electronic notebook is really to be encouraged. Another thing that I wanted to show you, more specific, even more specific to computational projects, is this. This is a kind of an add-on or an enhancement to your electronic notebook, which is, well, let me explain, let me show you. Often what the student is doing in a computational research project is they are executing code. So they might be writing computer programs to analyze some data. They might be executing a series of commands. Now, how is the student going to record that and record the results of that? If this was in the lab, they might put in their lab book a protocol for preparing some reagents, cloning some gene, running a gel, whatever, and then they would record the output of that, for example, a scan of a gel in the notebook. So what's the equivalent of that in a computational setting? Well, I encourage you using something like, where are we? A Jupyter notebook, or in my case, what we use in my lab is a RStudio notebook, and it looks like this. In fact, I'm going to switch to a screen where I've got one running live just to show you how it looks, and then I'll be almost done then. But I just want to show you how this looks, and it might again stimulate some questions and discussion later on. So this is how I would encourage my students to work. If they're creating code, running programs to analyze data. So this is what the environment looks like. This is the RStudio environment. They can edit their code in this window here. So we've got a whole bunch of commands here to install some packages, to do some analyses and so on. And then they can actually run the code within this environment, and it will generate output. And there are even functions here where you can click on a button and it will package all of this up into a very attractive looking report, which includes all of their original code and output from that and so on, all stamped with dates and times and so on. And that's a really good practice to get into for presenting progress at our meetings between student and supervisor, student and mentor, and also recording those in their electronic notebook. And I think that's probably a good place for me to stop. But hopefully that's stimulated a few ideas that we might discuss in the Q&A later. So thank you very much. So I'll hand over to Katya next.
David, many thanks for your informative presentation. I really liked how you showed how you record bioinformatics data and show the code and everything. I think that'll be a great complement to what I'm going to talk about next. So hello, everybody. Just give me a moment whilst I share my screen. Now, before we start, I would like to ask, can everybody see my presentation clearly?
Yes.
All right, just give me a nod or a yes or no. Wonderful. Let's begin. My name is Katja Hogard, and I am a final year PhD student at Imperial College London, researching with Professor Colin Turnbull. Today, I'm going to share my tips and tricks on how to make the most out of mentoring inexperienced researchers in the lab. I want to challenge everybody to change your mindset towards new and experienced researchers in the lab. It's very easy to see these strangers who come bumbling into our well-organized lab spaces as kind of a nuisance. After all, these young people might not know how to manage their time well. They might make the lab more disorganized by looking through drawers, looking for that one bottle of chemicals. They may waste our time with lots of annoying questions. However, what I want to challenge everybody to do now is to see those excited, energetic, passionate young people as a valuable resource and not as a burden. I just want to say that as an inexperienced researcher, I was sometimes made to feel like a burden by people who were supervising me in the past. And that really motivated me when I became a mentor myself, never to make a mentee feel like they were a nuisance or anything like that. I always wanted to make them feel like a valued member of the team. So with that philosophy in mind, let's go on to my presentation. I'd like to begin by talking about what to do before the new researchers set foot in the lab. Something that I and my supervisor always do is to come up with a set of well-designed project outlines. Now, these project outlines are a great starting place for inexperienced researchers. Often these students are keen to do research, but they just don't know where to get started. So that's why having well-defined but still flexible project outlines that align with the lab's main themes is really a great place to help these researchers begin. Since it's a good idea to make sure that these project outlines fit with the main themes of the lab, this means that these projects will probably use reliable core lab techniques so that mentors in the lab will be more familiar with the protocols and equipment the students will use. Another recommendation for avoiding awkwardness later down the line is to talk to your supervisor and lab mates about the delegation of mentoring tasks. In some cases, it makes sense for each PhD or postdoc to mentor one or two students throughout their whole project. Sometimes it makes sense to have one group member mentoring the students on plant and insect care, for example, and have another lab member mentoring the students whenever they are doing molecular work. Another thing to organize is to talk about lab space use. It's a great idea to have at least one or two bench spaces in the lab that are always held open for students to work on. And think of it as kind of a hot desk system. This means that the students won't accidentally start getting other permanent members' spaces disorganized looking for something. It's just great to know that this is this person's space, this is that person's space. It saves a lot of conflict later down the line. Another thing that I do is that I write simplified, written and illustrated protocols for the main lab techniques the students will be expected to use. A great example of this would be DNA extraction, because some of our students have done a lot of genotyping experiments. So with the simplified protocol in hand, they can use this like a cheat sheet to get started on some of these basic protocols they may not have done before. I also like to check in with the health and safety team at Imperial to catch up on what are the latest lab health and safety rules, which are sometimes updated between the academic years, just to make sure that you aren't giving students outdated or confusing advice. Let's talk about what happens when the students set foot in the lab and how we can help them make a strong start. As you can see from my candid photos there, a molecular biology lab is a pretty visually overwhelming place if you've never worked in one before. There are all these weird looking machines with cables coming out of them. There's all these brightly colored lab supplies. How do you even use this stuff? But that's why it's a great idea to have a lot of in-person mentoring with the students during their first 1 to 2 weeks in the lab to make sure that they feel comfortable and confident working in this environment. From day one, I always think of my students as being new junior researchers. I always like to have one-to-one meetings with my students to learn more about who they are and to find out what their aims and expectations are personally for these projects. This is a great time and a great place for students to share anything they want to disclose. For example, a disability, perhaps being part of the neurodivergent community, also any personal circumstances that might put limitations on what they can and cannot do, such as having a lengthy commute. I always like to ask the students about their personal aims and expectations. Some students just simply want to make that excellent grade and be done with it. Some people are really keen to go on to try to apply for graduate school and do more research. And as Gail mentioned before, I always encourage my students to think of their project as SMART goals. To me, that means specific, measurable, achievable, reasonable, and time-bound. Another thing that I always emphasize with my students when I'm working out the projects with them is to always set the hypothesis as the core of the project. With that hypothesis in mind, that's the inspiration and the aim for designing all of the experiments in the project to test that core hypothesis. In my experience, it's very important to take the time to do in-person demonstrations of where the lab spaces are and how to use them. Also to alert students to any lab spaces that may be shared with other groups and any booking systems that they should use with equipment. I also introduce students to using the key pieces of lab equipment and always encourage them that if you don't know how to use it, please ask me or another lab member, because it's more important to take up a bit of time doing that rather than risk damaging a valuable piece of lab equipment. I also make sure to demonstrate the health and safety rules to the students and make sure that they're well familiarized with them before they start running any experiments. Now let's talk about what happens during the project, because mentoring does not end within the first week of students working in the lab. I like the lighthouse mentoring style, which is based on the idea of lighthouse parenting. In this mentoring philosophy, the mentor sets a good example as a beacon, like a lighthouse. The mentor sets a good example by working efficiently, being professional in the lab, and just setting a good example that students can follow. Also, if you are a lighthouse mentor, it means that you're always present, but not interfering with what the student is doing all the time. You're there if the student needs to go to you for help, and you always try your best to be caring and supportive. On the other extreme, we could have a helicopter mentor, and that's a mentor who perhaps obsessively follows a student around and is always picking at and criticizing or telling them what to do. So the student really never gets to feel comfortable working independently or by themselves. And on the other end of the spectrum, you could have a jellyfish mentor, which is a mentor who is so passive and permissive that they don't really care what the students are doing. Just, go do your work. I have to work on my things. I don't really care what progress you're making or how you're feeling about the project. So that's why I recommend thinking of yourself as a lighthouse that's an example and the go-to source when they need that support. Speaking of providing support for students, those in the role of the mentor can sometimes feel like students are always overstepping the boundaries of time. Many mentors dislike that thing about students coming and pestering them while they're at their desks and the mentor is trying to work on their own research. How I've overcome this is I've set defined times and locations for further mentoring and one-to-one meetings. This also encourages good time management and professionalism among the students. And of course, I always give constructive feedback to the students with commendations and recommendations, and also encourage students to give me feedback on my teaching and mentoring style so that I can adapt it so it's a best fit to their learning style. It's always good to treat students as valued lab members, and part of how one can do this is to include them in lab meetings. It's important to always have space on the agenda for students to be able to talk about their own unique ideas regarding their projects, and also give them space to bring up any questions and concerns they have with the whole group so that they can get helpful feedback and suggestions. Now, what about the outcomes of this mentoring style? I will admit I haven't officially quantified it, but I have been mentoring students since 2018, and I'd say I've mentored about maybe 15 students in all, who could be master's students, undergraduate researchers in final year projects, and also summer students. And the trends I've noticed when I'm mentored in this way is that a strong start does indeed equal a strong finish. By investing this extra time and attention in the students during the first 1 to 2 weeks, we often have students who are working quite independently and confidently by week 3. What's great about this mentoring style is that it builds the real research skills. It's not just teaching to a test. We focus on hypothesis testing, experiment design, and the interpretation of results. By encouraging this independence and ownership of the projects, the students learn planning and time management in their projects. By including them in the lab meetings, we give them the opportunity to practice valuable presentation skills. Overall, in my exit meetings with my students, I found that many of the students I have mentored who aspire to do more research feel very empowered to apply to graduate school, to go on to Masters of Research degrees and PhD programs. Now, I'd like to thank everybody for their attention today, and I'm now going to hand things back to Gail so we can start our Q&A session. Thank you very much.